The day Madame Folake died, the village began to unravel. For years, the villagers of Ogandil had been accustomed to a certain rhythm in life. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a tantalizing aroma would begin to spread through the dusty streets, pulling people from their homes and drawing them to the heart of the village. That was where Madame Folake's small Akara stand stood, where the magic happened. Folake was no ordinary woman. She was loved and respected, but also feared, for reasons no one could quite put into words. Her Akara, those golden balls of fried goodness, were like nothing anyone had ever tasted before. Crisp on the outside, warm and soft on the inside, with a flavor that was impossible to describe but unforgettable once you tasted it. It was as if she had found a way to trap happiness inside those little balls of dough. People came from far and wide, from neighboring villages and even the city, just to buy Folake's Akara. The wealthy and the powerful made the journey too. It wasn't uncommon to see chieftains and even a king or two, waiting in line among the common folk, eager to get their share before it sold out. And it always sold out, often before the last person in line got their turn. But as beloved as Folake's Akara was, there was something else that people couldn't help but talk about: her cat, Sisi. Folake and Sisi were inseparable. Wherever you saw one, you saw the other. During the day, Sisi would sit in Folake's lap, purring contentedly as she went about her business. And in the evening, when the Akara stand was open, Sisi would sit at Folake's feet, eyes half closed, as if standing guard. People in the village whispered about the cat. Some said it was strange for a woman to care so much for an animal, treating it like a child. Others thought there was something more sinister about Sisi, something that made them uneasy. It didn't help that Folake never let anyone else touch the cat. If a curious child reached out a hand, Folake would pull Sisi away, with a look that made it clear the cat was off limits. Still, despite the gossip, people continued to buy Folake's Akara. Even those who swore they wouldn't return because of the cat found themselves back in line, unable to resist. There was just something about that Akara, something that made everything else fade away. But then, one day, Folake didn't open her stand. The sun set, and the familiar scent of frying beans was missing from the air. People came to her house, worried, and found her lying in bed, too weak to move. She had fallen ill, suddenly and without explanation. The news spread quickly. Her loyal customers, the ones who had traveled miles just to taste her Akara, were devastated. The village healer was called, then a traditionalist, and finally a doctor from the city. They all tried their best, but nothing worked. Folake's condition only worsened. As she lay in bed, fading fast, her thoughts turned to her only daughter, Yewanda. Yewanda was in her final year at university, studying hard for her exams. Folake had always been proud of her daughter, the first in their family to go to university. But now, as she felt her strength slipping away, she knew she needed to see Yewanda one last time. "Send for Yewanda," she whispered to the woman who was looking after her. "Tell her to come home. It's time." Yewanda received the message in the middle of the night. She was sitting in the library, surrounded by books, when her phone rang. The moment she heard the voice on the other end, she knew something was wrong. She packed her things and left immediately, not stopping to explain to anyone why she was leaving. There was no time. When Yewanda arrived home, she found her mother looking thinner and more fragile than she had ever seen her. The vibrant woman who had raised her, who had seemed invincible, was now barely able to lift her head from the pillow. "Mama," Yewanda said, kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here." Folake reached out and took her daughter's hand. "Yewanda," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You must take care of everything when I'm gone. Promise me." Yolanda shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Don't talk like that, Mama. You'll get better. We'll find a way." But Folake only smiled weakly. "There isn't much time, my child. I need you to listen. Under my bed, there's a box. Inside it, you'll find what you need to keep the business going. And Cece," she paused, looking over at the cat, who was curled up at the foot of the bed. "You must take care of Cece. No matter what happens, she must stay with you." Yolanda's heart sank. She had never liked Cece, had always found the cat's unblinking stare unsettling. But the look in her mother's eyes was so desperate, so pleading, that she couldn't refuse. "I promise, Mama," she said, though her voice shook as she spoke. Folake smiled again, and closed her eyes. That night, she passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Cece curled up beside her. The village was plunged into mourning. People came from all over to pay their respects, and the funeral was a grand affair. But beneath the sorrow, there was a growing sense of unease. What would happen now that Folake was gone? Who would make the Akara? And what would become of Cece? Yolanda stayed in the village for the next few weeks, too numb with grief to do much of anything. The box her mother had told her about sat unopened in the corner of her room. She couldn't bring herself to look inside. She spent most of her days in a daze, trying to come to terms with the fact that her mother was really gone. It wasn't until the third week that she finally found the courage to open the box. Inside, she found old letters, charms, and a small, worn journal with her mother's handwriting. The first page was a simple note: "Take care of Cece. She holds the key." Yolanda frowned, confused. What did her mother mean? She turned the pages of the journal, hoping for an explanation, but found only recipes and notes about the Akara business. Nothing that explained the cryptic message. But the more she thought about it, the more she began to wonder. Could Cece really have something to do with her mother's success? It sounded absurd, but then again, nothing about this situation was normal. She began to watch Cece more closely, trying to see what her mother had seen in the cat. But Cece was just as inscrutable as ever, sitting quietly in the corner, watching everything with those wide, unblinking eyes. Meanwhile, the village was starting to change. Without Folake's Akara, things began to go wrong. Businesses that had been thriving started to falter. People who had once been promoted found themselves demoted, or worse, out of work entirely. It was as if the luck that had followed them when Folake was alive had suddenly vanished. Rumors began to spread. Some people said that Folake had been using their destinies to make her Akara taste so good, and that now she was gone, they were paying the price. Others insisted that was nonsense, pointing out that their lives had only improved after eating her Akara. But no one could deny that something strange was happening. Yolanda heard the whispers, and they only added to her growing sense of unease. She didn't know what to do. She had promised her mother she would take care of the business, but she didn't even know where to start. The recipes in the journal were familiar, but they didn't seem to hold any special secrets. And as for Cece, the cat was as much a mystery as ever. One night, unable to sleep, Yolanda found herself sitting on the floor of her mother's old room, the box open in front of her. Cece was sitting nearby, watching her as always. "What do you want from me?" Yolanda muttered, half to herself, half to the cat. "What am I supposed to do?" Cece blinked slowly, then stood up and walked over to the box. She nudged it with her nose, then looked up at Yolanda expectantly. What is it? Yowanda asked, reaching into the box. Her hand brushed against something she hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath the layers of paper and charms. She pulled it out and saw that it was a small, ornate key, made of a dark, shiny metal she didn't recognize. She stared at the key, her heart pounding. What was this? And what did it open? Cece meowed softly, and Yowanda looked at her, feeling a chill run down her spine. The cat's eyes were fixed on the key, and for a moment, Yowanda could have sworn there was something almost human in those eyes. Suddenly, the room felt too small, too suffocating. She needed to get out, to think. She grabbed the key and stood up, nearly tripping over the box in her haste. She stumbled out of the room and into the cool night air. The village was quiet, everyone asleep in their homes. She walked aimlessly, her mind racing, the key clutched tightly in her hand. Eventually, she found herself standing in front of the Akara stand. It looked different in the dark, almost eerie. The place that had once been the heart of the village now seemed abandoned, forgotten. She hesitated, then walked over to the stand. Her fingers traced the worn wood, the memories of her mother's laughter, the scent of frying beans, all flooding back. And then, she saw it. A small, almost invisible keyhole, hidden in the side of the stand, right where her mother had always stood. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what she was holding in her hand. With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. There was a soft click, and a hidden compartment popped open. Inside was a small, dusty book, bound in black leather. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. The title, written in her mother's familiar handwriting, simply read, "The Truth." She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. The more she read, the colder she felt. The book detailed rituals, sacrifices, and dark secrets that had been passed down through the generations. The ingredients for the Akara were not just beans and spices. There were other things that made Yowanda's stomach turn. But it was the last page that made her blood run cold. It was a letter, addressed to her. "Yowanda, my beloved daughter," it began. "By now, you have discovered the truth. I did what I had to do to survive, to give you a better life. But every choice has a cost. The cat, Cece, is more than she seems. She is the guardian of our family's secret, and she is bound to the one who holds the key. But be warned, once you accept this responsibility, there is no turning back. You must decide whether to continue the tradition, or to let it die with me. Whatever you choose, know that I will always love you." Yowanda's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the book. She looked down at Cece, who had followed her to the stand. The cat was sitting quietly at her feet, watching her with those unblinking eyes. The weight of her mother's words settled heavily on her shoulders. She understood now why her mother had been so insistent that she take care of Cece. The cat wasn't just a pet. It was a part of the family's dark legacy, a legacy that Yowanda had unwittingly inherited. But what was she supposed to do now? Continue the rituals, the sacrifices, in order to keep the Akara stand going? Or walk away, and let the secret die with her mother? As she stood there, the village around her dark and silent, she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Whatever she chose, nothing would ever be the same. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the village. Yowanda took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had to make a decision, and soon. But as she stood there, staring at the cat, she realized something unsettling. Cece was no longer watching her with those passive, unblinking eyes. The cat's gaze had changed, and for the first time, Yolanda saw something in those eyes that made her heart skip a beat. It was as if Cece was waiting for something. But what? Yolanda's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Was Cece more than just a guardian? Could the cat have its own agenda, something even her mother hadn't known about? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much bigger, something that went beyond her family's secrets. But there was no time to dwell on it. She had to make a choice. And whatever that choice was, she knew it would change everything. With a heavy heart, Yolanda turned and walked away from the stand, the book and the key clutched tightly in her hand. Cece followed her, silent as a shadow. As she walked back to the house, she couldn't help but wonder what had her mother really gotten involved in. And what would happen now that the secret was out? But most of all, she wondered about Cece. What was the cat's true nature? And what would it do if Yolanda chose to break the cycle? The questions gnawed at her, leaving her with a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. She knew she had to find the answers, but she also knew that doing so would come at a cost. As she reached the front door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The house felt different now, as if it was hiding something just beneath the surface. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, Cece following close behind. The room was bathed in the soft light of dawn, but instead of bringing comfort, it only made the shadows seem darker. Yolanda sat down at the table, placing the book in front of her. She knew she had to read more, to understand the full extent of what her mother had done. But the thought of what she might find made her stomach turn. She looked down at Cece, who had jumped onto the table and was now sitting beside the book, watching her intently. The cat's gaze was almost unnerving, as if it was waiting for her to do something. Yolanda reached out a trembling hand and opened the book to the next page. Her mother's handwriting filled the pages, detailing the rituals and the sacrifices in excruciating detail. It was all there, the instructions for keeping the Akara stand successful, and the price that had to be paid for it. But as she read, something else caught her eye. A series of symbols, drawn in the margins of the pages, symbols that didn't match anything else in the book. They were strange, almost alien, and they filled Yolanda with a sense of dread. "What are these?" she whispered, more to herself than to Cece. The cat didn't answer, of course, but Yolanda couldn't shake the feeling that Cece knew more than she was letting on. She flipped through the book, finding more of the symbols scattered throughout, hidden among the recipes and instructions. They seemed to form a pattern, but one that she couldn't quite decipher. The unease in her stomach grew stronger. She had to find out what these symbols meant, but she didn't know where to start. Her mother had always been secretive, but this was something else entirely. She needed help. But who could she turn to? The villagers were superstitious, and most of them had already started avoiding her, whispering that she was cursed, just like her mother. Yolanda's mind raced as she tried to think of someone who could help her. Someone who wouldn't be scared off by the strange symbols, or by Cece. And then, it hit her. There was one person, someone who had always been a little different, someone who had never been afraid of the unknown. Old man Adisa. Adisa had lived on the outskirts of the village for as long as anyone could remember. He was a recluse, but people said he knew things that most people wouldn't even want to think about. Some said he was a witch doctor, others said he was a scholar of the old ways. But whatever he was, Yolanda knew he was her only hope. She stood up, the book still in her hand, and made her way to the door. Cece jumped down from the table and followed her, as if sensing where she was going. The walk to Odysseus' house was long, and as she walked, Yolanda couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The village was quiet, too quiet, and every rustle in the bushes made her heart skip a beat. When she finally reached Odysseus' house, she hesitated. The old man's house was small and unassuming, but there was something about it that made her uneasy. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching her just as Cece did. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no answer. But just as she was about to turn away, the door creaked open, and Odysseus appeared. He was an old man, his face lined with wrinkles and his eyes sharp and piercing. He looked at her with a gaze that seemed to see right through her, and for a moment, Yolanda wondered if she had made a mistake. But before she could say anything, Odysseus nodded. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice low and raspy. Yolanda blinked, surprised. "You have?" Odysseus smiled faintly, his eyes flicking down to the book in her hand. "You've come about the symbols, haven't you?" Yolanda nodded, too stunned to speak. Odysseus stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Come. We have much to discuss." Yolanda hesitated, then stepped inside, Cece close on her heels. The house was dimly lit, filled with the scent of herbs and old wood. It was cluttered, with shelves full of strange objects and books that looked older than Odysseus himself. Odysseus led her to a small table, where he motioned for her to sit. He took the book from her and began to flip through it, his eyes narrowing as he examined the symbols. "These are ancient," he muttered, more to himself than to Yolanda. "Older than your mother, older than this village." Yolanda swallowed hard, her unease growing. "What do they mean?" Odysseus looked up at her, his expression grave. "They are marks of power, of a pact made long ago. Your family has been tied to this for generations, though I doubt even your mother understood the full extent of it." Yolanda's heart pounded in her chest. "What kind of pact?" Odysseus sighed, closing the book and setting it down on the table. "A pact with something otherworldly. Something that requires sacrifice, in exchange for power and success. Your mother continued the tradition, but now, it's up to you to decide whether to continue it, or to break the cycle." Yolanda felt a chill run down her spine. "And if I break the cycle?" Odysseus' eyes darkened. "There will be consequences. The pact cannot be broken without a price. But continuing it, that comes with a cost as well." Yolanda's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The symbols, the rituals, the sacrifices, it was all too much. But the thought of continuing the tradition, of carrying on the dark legacy her mother had left behind, filled her with dread. She looked down at Cece, who was sitting quietly beside her chair. The cat's eyes were still fixed on her, watching her with that unnerving gaze. "What should I do?" she whispered, more to herself than to Odysseus. Odysseus didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and walked over to one of the shelves, pulling down a small, ornate box. He brought it over to the table and set it down in front of her. "This," he said, opening the box to reveal a small, intricately carved knife, "is the tool your ancestors used to make the sacrifices. It has been passed down through your family for generations." Yolanda stared at the knife, her stomach turning. I can't do that." Odysseus' gaze softened slightly. "No one said it would be easy. But you must make a choice. The pact must either be upheld, or it must be broken. And you are the only one who can decide." Yolanda felt tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't want any of this. She didn't want to be part of some dark, twisted tradition. But what choice did she have? If she didn't continue the rituals, who knew what would happen to her, to the village? But the thought of making sacrifices, of carrying on the legacy her mother had left behind, made her feel sick to her core. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Adisa reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Whatever you choose, know that you are not alone. You have the strength to make the right decision, even if it's the hardest one." Yewande nodded, wiping her tears away. She looked down at the knife, then back at the book, and finally at Sisi. The cat was still watching her, but now, there was something different in its eyes. A flicker of understanding. Sympathy. It was hard to tell, but it gave Yewande a small sense of comfort. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't continue the cycle. She couldn't be part of the darkness that had haunted her family for generations. "I'm going to break the pact," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Adisa nodded, though his expression was somber. "Then you must be prepared for the consequences." Yewande swallowed hard. "What kind of consequences?" Adisa's eyes darkened. "The pact will fight back. It will try to reclaim what was promised to it. You must be strong, and you must be ready to face whatever comes." Yewande felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but she nodded. "I understand." Adisa reached into the box and pulled out a small vial filled with a dark liquid. "This will help you sever the connection. But it will also weaken you, leave you vulnerable. You must use it wisely." Yewande took the vial, her hands trembling. "Thank you." Adisa gave her a small, sad smile. "I wish you luck, Yewande. And remember, whatever happens, you are not alone." Yewande nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She slipped the vial into her pocket and stood up, the book and the knife still in her hands. As she made her way to the door, Sisi following close behind, she couldn't help but wonder if she was making the right choice. But deep down, she knew that she couldn't continue the cycle, no matter what the cost. The walk back to the village was long and silent. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the path. But the warmth of the morning did nothing to chase away the cold knot of fear in Yewande's stomach. When she finally reached the Akara stand, she hesitated. The place looked different in the daylight, less eerie, but still, the memories of her mother's dark secret hung heavily in the air. Yewande took a deep breath and pulled out the vial. She uncorked it and poured the liquid onto the ground, right where the hidden compartment had been. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the ground began to tremble, and the air grew thick with a strange, heavy energy. Yewande stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. Sisi hissed, her fur standing on end, and Yewande felt a surge of fear. What had she done? What was coming? But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the trembling stopped. The air cleared, and the strange energy dissipated, leaving only silence behind. Yewande stared at the ground, her heart still racing. Had it worked? Had she really broken the pact? She looked down at Sisi, who had calmed down and was now sitting quietly beside her, watching her with those unblinking eyes. For a moment, Yewande felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. But then, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and she stumbled. A deep, low rumble echoed through the air, and Yewande's heart leapt into her throat. The ground cracked open, and from the darkness below, something began to emerge. Something ancient, something that had been buried for generations. Yowanda's breath caught in her throat as she watched in horror. She had thought she could break the pact, but now she realized that she had only awakened something far worse. The ground continued to shake, and Yowanda stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Whatever she had unleashed, it was coming for her, and there was no way to stop it. Sisi let out a low, menacing growl, and Yowanda's heart pounded in her chest. She had made a terrible mistake, and now, she would have to face the consequences. As the thing from the darkness rose higher, Yowanda felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew that it was far worse than anything she had ever imagined. And then, just as the creature was about to fully emerge, everything went still. The ground stopped shaking, and the air grew eerily quiet. For a moment, Yowanda dared to hope that it was over, that she had somehow managed to stop whatever was coming. But then, she heard it. A low, guttural growl, coming from the darkness below. Yowanda's blood ran cold. She had only delayed the inevitable. Whatever she had awakened was still there, waiting, watching. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out of here, had to find a way to stop this before it was too late. But even as she turned to run, she knew that she would never be able to escape. The thing from the darkness was coming for her, and there was no way to stop it. As she ran through the village, Sisi close on her heels, Yowanda's mind raced. She had to find a way to fix this, had to find a way to undo what she had done. But deep down, she knew that it was too late. The pact had been broken, and now, she would have to face the consequences. And as the shadows closed in around her, Yowanda realized that she was not just running from the thing in the darkness. She was running from herself, from the darkness that had been passed down through her family for generations. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the truth. The darkness was inside her, and it would always be there, waiting. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, Yowanda knew that she would never be free. The end was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it.